Hey Akshay,
How you doing?
doing well. So, hi everyone, I'm Matt at Terminal 49, one of the co-founders. I lead our data efforts.
And I'm Akshay, co-founder and CEO of Terminal 49.
So, you ready to talk about ocean carrier APIs today, Akshay?
Let's do it. Yeah, this topic kind of came to fruition because I am on a panel at the TPM conference by JOC this year. And we're going to be talking about the state of ocean carrier APIs. So I figured, you and I have a conversation about it because we talk about this
Yeah.
subject quite often.
I mean, there's not much to say, right? They all have one. They all have a sign up form on their website where they give you an API key. You give them the BL numbers and you get all the data you need nicely formatted. It's not much of a topic, really.
That's a aspirational state. But that's a good place to start. I mean, I think there's been a lot of conversation, right, because of the DCSA standard, and the adopters of the standard, the companies, ocean carriers that are participating, MSC, and there's a bunch of other ones,
Hmm.
which is, I think, a really good initiative to standardize how to provide this data and how to consume this data, right, across multiple sources of this data, multiple ocean carriers, and potentially even multiple terminals and other sources. Yeah, so where are we on that?
On the
What's this
DCSA
current?
front specifically, or?
I think that's one step of it, one kind of piece of the puzzle, right? If
Mhm.
I'm a cargo or a freight forwarder, and I ideally want to integrate an API once and just like turn on a bunch of integrations. I work with Maersk, I work MSC, I work with the OCL, Hapag Lloyd, what have you. And ideally, everybody has the same API, and I get an API key, as you just mentioned, and I start tracking, making requests to those APIs, and I don't have to worry about different formats, different
Sure.
events, different timestamps. The different ergonomics is it's like the same, it's like a standardized window. It's going to fit, in different. You buy it from different vendors, and it's like it's going to work, right? Or it's like a socket, right? You buy plugs from different. You have different. So socket is actually a good example. It's like we've decided that the plug works the same way. Whether I buy a toaster or a phone charger, it's going to always plug in. So that's the idea. But are we there yet?
Well, the short answer is no, but I think DCSA, I have been surprised at the adoption, and I think it is helping. First of all, like that consortium is trying to solve a whole lot more issues than just like the visibility of your container. There are many aspects to it, and the track and trace portion of their APIs is just one facet. And second of all, like they have gone extremely deep and kept pushing over years now to get to where they're at. And I actually think if you're talking about the DCSA, 2.2 track and trace API, it's pretty nice. It's well designed and it kind of works with existing standards, for locations and events. Like there's some SMDG in there, there's some BIC code, so like you can build on top of stuff you may already have. And if you're with carrier A and they're using it, and now you're with carrier B, and like, hey, here's our DCSA thing. Well, then it's just a question of kind of plugging it in and vetting. Hey, is this working the same way as everything coming through how we expect? So from that perspective, I think it's great that there is a kind of standard out there that more and more carriers are adopting, but not all of them. And that's kind of always the case. You mentioned Maersk and OCL and MSCs. Depending who you're talking to, some have like they've already had an API. They've had it for a long time. They don't want to change it, and it's completely not interoperable with anything DCSA, and none of the standards are used. They've just done their own thing, and it's a huge lift for them to say, yeah, actually, let's just kind of offer the DCSA one alongside it. It's not like they could switch. Think of how many customers they have who have invested large amounts of money integrating the existing solution. So from a business perspective, it's not perfectly aligned incentives for some people who have kind of been ahead of this and had an API to begin with to say, yeah, we're going to support this. But if you're starting from scratch, and we've seen Zim, we've seen Evergreen, We're seeing Hapag-Lloyd. If you're like, we don't have an API offering, they're all coming out and using the DCSA standard, which is great.
Yeah. And why do you think that's happening? Do we have access to any of these APIs? Like, are we using the DCSA API? And if what's been your experience working with them?
So again, working with the format from a technical perspective is pretty good. And you can write a good integration and consume that data with minimal code because it's just well thought through. So it's nice to work with from a technical perspective. But with every shipping line, well, how do you get that? What's the procurement process? Do you need, like, are you even as a third party able to have any access to it? Maybe not. It runs the gamut from, yes, here's the link to our developer portal, sign up, submit your application, and we'll look at it and approve it, and then we'll get on with things, to, yes, here it is, sign up, and then we'll talk, because, you're going to have to pay for this, and, work out some business terms, and, how much are you going to be using, to, yes, sign up, but then we need LOAs from everyone, and there's all this kind of process around which containers you're able to submit, and which ones you're not, and how you have access to that. And that gets complicated. And then there's no, you can't have that API key. That's just for BCOs right now. Sorry. So that's more of the frustration part. Like, great standard, great APIs. Please let us help our mutual customers to use those and get the benefits of all that interoperability, standardization, and everything.
Right. So there's kind of like, it's a little bit of a walled garden, or it's behind a lock and a key that you can't really get access to it.
It can be, yes.
It can be, and then different ocean carriers have different commercial agreements, right? How they're charging for it, how they're invoicing for it. Some are based on events, and some are based on the number of calls that you're making. Some are based on the number of containers you're tracking. So you have to manage that. So if you are a large freight forwarder, I mean, actually not even large, like if you're a freight forwarder that's helping your customers move containers across pretty much all the major ocean carriers, and all of them had APIs that they supported, you would still have to go make arrangements with all of them, if at all you can get access to the API.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, then let's say you've integrated it, you have different commercial agreements with everybody. That's just not possible today. It's based on our experience working with ocean carriers. And we are kind of in this, we are not the ideal customer for an ocean carrier, because they want to work directly with freight forwarders and cargo owners. But cargo owners and freight forwarders don't necessarily want to work with these APIs directly because of the challenges.
Yeah. If you're big enough, you may want to go there and do all the work and invest all the time. But you really need significant scale for that to make sense. Yeah.
Right.
As an option.
Yeah, and those large companies are still, excuse me, a relatively small pool of the overall global trade.
Yeah, because there's a long tail, as we know.
Yeah, so that means, like, okay, I'm Walmart, I'm Amazon, I got lots of engineering resources, I can do this. But if you want to improve the user experience for all of the operators that move these containers, have data for they make this data accessible, which is the goal of these APIs at the end of the day, right? Make it more accessible so you can integrate into your ERP, put it into your TMS, have it accessible so you don't have to manually track these containers. That's why we're talking about this, is the way this experience is to consume, integrate these APIs is really only ideal for large companies.
Yeah. And again, remember, DCSA, like, the track and trace is one portion of it. All the other sides of it and the problems they're trying to solve, some of those are more just B2B. We work with this terminal, this works with this shipping line. Hey, we're spinning up a new thing. Let's make sure it works with DCSA so that the integration process is easy and we know we have high quality data at that level. The other thing one thing I want to bring up, like as I was thinking about this question of DCSA APIs, I have a lot of empathy for shipping lines, right? They even as the shipping line doing the coordination work you're doing, and you have all these arrangements with the different terminals. Sometimes you own the terminals, sometimes you don't. At the volumes of stuff they're moving and needing like everything to work operationally, and the complete, just imagine how different every terminal's operations is. Everyone does it the same way, right? At the end of the day, you're kind of, depending on which country you're in, like the process is pretty similar, and there's just like kind of a few dials you might tweak. But they do not do it all the same way in terms of how they manage and automate and track that, the software they use, the processes they have, how that data gets submitted, the timeliness. Some things are fairly well standard and automated, discharged. Majority of modern terminals, that's just all wired up to the cranes and gets transmitted immediately. But then other things, not so much. You can have 3 carriers all using DCSA. They've all kind of following the spec exactly, and still see either on a carrier by carrier basis different qualities of data, its timeliness, its completeness, and so on, because they just have different kind of internal operations around moving data.
Can you provide an example like of these idiosyncrasies between like one? Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of the same as when you go to their website. Forget DCSA for a second. We all know, depending which website you go to, the data's of a different quality.
Are you talking about like going to MERS to track a container versus an OCL to track?
Yeah, right. You kind of get a feel for like, yeah, I expect them to like maybe not be very reliable around that data point, or for it to be delayed when it's coming from this country or so on. That's just kind of, you sort of get used to it. Or you get used to seeing kind of things, those departures. I'm going to double check that because it has a tendency to like change if I check back tomorrow. So all those kind of idiosyncrasies of like moving data around and actually understanding what's going on, we see those all coming through the APIs as well, just like you would if you go to the website.
And like, what's kind of a paper cut that you're talking about? Like, can you give an example of an event or location?
It's very simple. You're just missing an event you need. You really want to know the vessel was loaded. You've told the vessel has departed, but was it loaded? You can have the DCSA API, but if it doesn't give you that event in the payload, and you go to that website and it doesn't tell you it was loaded, you're still getting on the phone or email trying to understand, hey, can you confirm my container was loaded on that vessel?
So are there many carriers that just don't provide certain events on their through their APIs?
Yes and no. Like, I think there are a few exceptions where, like, with some carriers, like some smaller carriers, it's like, yeah, you're just not gonna see that very often. But that's rare. Most of them, like, really try. Like I said, this is where the empathy comes in. It's just really hard. And it's like, depending where it's coming from, and like some of these origin places are tiny. We've seen lots of issues around stuff, textiles products moving from Asia, where yes, they're leaving some major port of lading, but actually it's coming from Cambodia, right? It's coming from this river terminal, and it's being moved by this barge service. And does the shipping carrier, even though, the ocean carrier who is contracting with them, even though for sure they was loaded, like maybe not. Like, it's very hard to know what's going at the ends and kind of tentacles of all these supply chains.
Right. So I guess what you're saying is a lot of these events loaded, gate into the port,
Mm-hmm.
gate out the port, even the set of holds or fees, releases. That data is being generated at the terminal or at the locations, right?
That's
And
it.
it's generated and then relayed by some system to the ocean carriers via some way method is typically EDI, right? So let's say a specific example of, Oakland SSA terminal. They have a few different ocean carriers that load and unload vessels over there. In order for them to provide those milestones from their website, they got to receive it from the SSA terminal in Oakland through an EDI feed.
Exactly. How else could they know? How else could they know if the terminal doesn't tell them what's happened? How else can Maersk or MSC know what's going on the ground?
Right. Their completeness and latency is only as good as their integration with that said terminal. And then that terminal, that data doesn't get magically created. Either there's some automation, like that to an extreme degree of automation is like automatically scanning, the container gets gated in, that record gets created, sent via ADM. But that's like not even the common case. The common case is somebody's like checking, writing down the container number on a paper, then inputting into the system, then saying that gate in, right, at this time, and human error can't happen there. So, these systems have become pretty robust, and terminals are doing very good job at making sure like this kind of human error doesn't happen. But it can happen, but certainly latency can happen, and the systems between those two might not be perfect. So the data is only as good as like its entire pipeline of what's going on and how well it's working.
Yeah.
Right?
And it's hard. Like, I think human error might be more, or system error, if you're thinking about a terminal, might be more common than you think. Like, how often do we see unable to locate? We think your container is still in the terminal. We're sending someone out on the ground to go find it right now.
Consider, share a fact that you can get tracking data on the website for most containers at a reasonable amount of time, and it just mostly works at like the scale it's working at, and like the amount of integrations there are. It's kind of a blessing.
Yeah, it's staggering.
Yeah, I mean, but I do think like as a society we're there, right? We charge a credit card and it just works more often than not, and it's relatively similar in terms of like the level of integration, if not like an order of magnitude even more complex payment systems. I guess what you're saying is like it's not all straightforward. It is complicated. There's a lot of going on under the hood, and
like for example, imagine your Maersk or MSC. Just think of the volume of events coming in from all over the world every minute. And then you have to get those associated with the right system. Like you get messages about containers and BLs and stuff. You have to get them associated with the right records. And then you need to get them, those records need to show up through the website and the API. It's a very large data problem, just from a kind of...
Yeah, it's large, but it's not like, we're talking about hundreds of thousands to millions of events per minute. Maybe not that, more than that. It's human scale.
It's human scale, but as my neighbor was telling me when he worked at unnamed shipping line 20 years ago, he was very upset they wouldn't pay to upgrade the server where they batch processed stuff every day. And when they ran out of disk space, right? This was 20 years ago, but like it just gives you a kind of... Shipping lines, for the most part, core competency is building networks and supply chains and moving containers. With some exceptions, historically, it has not been information technology. So kind of we come at this from like, the startup standpoint with all these amazing databases and tools, and like over the past 20 years, like, what Facebook did when they first did it was like, oh my God, but now anyone could like get started with just, software as a service. That's not necessarily how things are evolving and have been happening inside of these shipping lines, which are mostly legacy enterprise systems with lots of old technical infrastructure to support and so on and so forth.
Right. Yeah, we're trying to get these legacy systems to work like a modern system in 2024.
Right.
Which,
so yeah,
if you were to build it from scratch, you could probably have a lot more.
Yeah, you would think about it differently. Yeah. But they don't stop. They can't build from scratch. They can't stop moving containers for their customers.
Right. What do you think is going to happen? Let's assume that more and more ocean carriers are going to adopt the DCSA. At the minimum, they're going to provide their own API. Do you think? And let's just talk a little bit about the incentive models. I mean, on one side, they do provide a way to customers to track containers, right? I mean, kind of have to. They're like a logistics service. If they move containers, we want to tell what's going on. It's arguably part of the service in this day and age. Maybe like 50 years ago, like you just kind of had to assume it reached its destination unless you had, a pigeon coming by and telling you like this container has arrived after like, a whole half a year. Anyways, let's assume that that is a need that they need to satisfy for their customer, and they do already do it through their website. Do they have an obligation to provide this programmatically? Like, does Maersk, should they provide an API? Or should they be required to provide an API? Should the customer demand an API?
Great
What's the
question.
incentive?
I mean, I'm interested in your take as well. Like, what we're seeing is like obviously more people are coming out with APIs, and that's happening because of demand, right? For average, people who are integrating, like no one's interested in paying a lot of money for EDI, which is kind of slow and jank. It works, and it has worked, and it will probably still be there in the background, but no one wants to sign up for that today. I think that interoperability side of DCSA, even though it extends to the track and trace API, I think that's more about the internal, so to say, operations of the supply chain networks and the external communication of that data to the stakeholders. Even though every shipping, like almost every shipping line today has a public place to track containers, we have also seen trends with some shipping lines from China who are actually reducing the amount of data they're sharing on their website rather than increasing it. So it's like you can only see like the most recent events, for example, versus the event history of a container lifecycle. Like we said at the top, some ocean carriers are fine just letting people sign up and just vetting who you are and then giving you an API key. And some don't want that at all. They want to know like that this is only happening if you're on the waybill. The things that make it hard to predict how this is all going to shake out, like some of the forces, like one is security, like national security. Like, we're seeing lots of kinds of, in other spaces, the government trying to make people more security conscious and think about which vendors you're using and, share the right amount of information and so on. We've seen this with rail, which is a slightly different scenario because, they're even more legacy than the shipping line and they also have kind of a de facto monopoly, but for the most part, very uninterested in making data available at all. So maybe it goes more that direction. I think the other trend, which is interesting, which we're seeing from some of the bigger, more sophisticated shipping lines, is they're seeing what's happening in the marketplace with people looking for more and more visibility. And they're like, great, let's try and verticalize that in our solution to have some differentiation. Hapag-Lloyd, pay them $20 at the beginning of a journey and you'll get, the GPS of your reefer all the way, for example. And they're trying to bring more and more into like a more sort of, vertically integrated. I don't know if there's a better term than that to describe the sort of kind of experience and data quality they're trying to deliver. The shipping lines are in competition with each other, right? I don't know from an incentive perspective what the benefit is for them all to have. It's kind of like, maybe another analogy would be like cars and like Android Play and CarPlay, right? Consumers love it as far as we know, but we still see automakers removing it from cars in favor of their own bespoke entertainment experience. Why would you do that? Customers don't like it, but it's like, well, we're against these guys and we're trying to be different.
I think the business models at play, and the incentive models are unfortunately misaligned. It's not like me trying to be a conspiracy theorist or anything.
Well, what tell it?
When I order, something, I don't know if you've had this experience, but like if I order something with Uber Eats or DoorDash, and it says like, hey, it's going to come in 30 minutes, right? Well, it's been like 45 minutes, and then I see on the map the driver is like going the other direction, like doing something else. Immediately, I want to message DoorDash, and I'm like, what the heck is going on here? Or I message the driver, like, where are you going? So now what's happening is because of the visibility that I have, I'm trying to hold these guys accountable, right? When the promise is not being fulfilled. So the ocean carriers are making some promises. There are some SLAs, so to speak, like
Hmm.
agreement. Maybe I don't know if they're hard agreements or not, but there is some expectation. Like this vessel is going to take 3 weeks from Shanghai to Los Angeles, and it's gonna come, and the terminal is going to unload it and make it available. And so, if I'm aware of these milestones happening, specifically around the demurrage per diem, which is, an additional cost, where there is an obligation to allow the terminal should provide enough freight time to the ocean carrier slash cargo owner to pick up that container
Hmm.
if all the releases are happening in time. I kind of look at it this way: is like if if I had a pretty good idea of all the ETAs for all the vessels, all
Hmm.
my containers coming in, and they're updated regularly, right? Then I have some agency to make sure all the releases can happen on time. If all the releases are happening on time, because I have some more agency and control over it, because of the visibility, I'll have more time to pick up the container. If I have more time to pick up the container and I have more controls around having accountability over my trucking companies to make sure they make appointments, and if there are enough appointments available and have visibility around that, then I am systematically reducing the risk of me having demurrage. And similarly per diem. If demurrage costs something like $100, $200 per day per container, where a lot of that revenue is additional revenue going to the ocean carriers, because otherwise it's sunk costs already, right? They've already paid for the terminal lease or whatever that is. Maybe there's some variable cost, but maybe it's not that much variable cost, right? That is all margin, and it's fair margin if it's fair, right? It's like you're holding the container at my terminal. It's like real estate. I'm going to charge you more than my cost, which is totally fair. It's like a business. But I think where it becomes tricky is like if you didn't let me do everything in my ability to optimize my supply chain to pick up my container, which is really one way to do it is provide the visibility, then those incentives start looking like misaligned. So I think that's one. The other one is very simple. It's like it does, to your point, it costs a lot of money to build these systems and support them. You know, you might even just not even break even by charging for these APIs,
Hmm.
because you need a team, significant team. Maris probably has a team of dozens of people supporting this platform. Engineers
Hmm.
are cheap, or they're not cheap, right? They're spending millions of dollars to support the system. You might not make millions of dollars of revenue to track to. So you are, as a management, you're like, should we be doing this? Should we be providing API? How does this help our business? It
Wouldn't
is
you
a
assume? Wouldn't you assume there's some amount of you got to build it anyway internally? Like you have to know as a shipping line what's going on to deliver anything.
fair enough, but we build a lot of things internally that we don't productize, right?
Yeah.
I guess I'm just saying is like just because you've built it, when you produce, you want to productize it if it's going to make you profit, right?
Hmm.
As you scale that, and you want to be able to scale that system. And it is not a product in its current form that's going to be very profitable product line for a shipping carrier. So I can be empathetic to them that like it's not in their interest to provide these APIs. And so there is a dilemma here, right? And I would go as far as saying like the reason we don't have these APIs that are completely freely accessible is because they're not incentivized to provide them. Otherwise, if they were incentivized to provide them, it would have already happened, right? Um, Incentive models drive action. I think I don't know if there's enough push for these ocean carriers to do it. It's maybe doing it is because it's the right thing to do.
Yeah. I think the incentives get more aligned is like the right thing to do. Like I think there is the pressure, and we're seeing them roll out, and there is like a kind of basic expectation now, and probably a few more years it will be like the exception where it's like, well, you don't have an API yet, like at all, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to make it available to everyone.
This is where the government needs to step in, right? Because they are the arbiter of what is the right thing to do
Hmm.
and who should do it, right? What is the right and wrong as society, like to further economic interest of the country, right? It's like to have some regulation. There's already happening around demurrage and per diem invoices. There's some requirements around like you got to provide these milestones at these time frames if you're going to charge people. So it's happening, and providing these APIs along the same lines. It's going to help trade. It's going to help efficiency in global trade. And I think the FMC and the government bodies, in my view, should require ocean carriers to provide
Like to have a plan and a date by which they must have it. Yeah.
using these DCSA standards.
But does that mean, kind of like with the FMC thing, where we've seen like who gets those invoices? The BCO. And we just kind of, you were discussing earlier that like you have this long tail of BCOs. Are they going to go integrate APIs with everyone? Right? The government can make that a requirement and they can deliver that requirement, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's like a free for all and anyone can have access.
Because what can happen is this already exists, right? Like there are many systems where you need to get an authorization, right? This happens in the business context, right? Like I need an approval to buy something as an employee. I ask my management, they approve it. So that's a second order function, which is like I'm totally cool with like, yeah, only make it accessible to cargo owners. They can then provide access to their service providers or a company like 49 or their trucking company, right? Because it's going to help them, the cargo owner. So they can control that access. But I don't think that should be the and if there's some friction over there, that's okay. But
I don't
right
know
now,
that there is, and that's kind of what's already happened previously with EDI, right?
right.
Hey, we work with this EDI solution provider. Customer signs up with them, pays them some money, and they just facilitate the transaction of that data. They're not getting they have some, I guess they have some special dispensation from the carrier, like, hey, we work with you and you're on our approved list. That's kind of it.
Yeah. All right. I think we've had a pretty hearty conversation about this topic. Anything else you want to cover, Matt, about the ocean carrier APIs?
The only thing I want to say is if you're out there and you're listening, please support the push notifications for these APIs, because charging per request and then having no idea when you make a request if you're going to get any more data or not is quite upsetting.
Yeah, right. That's totally fair. All righty. Well, I guess the last thing I would say is like if you want the data now, right? And you don't want to depend on these APIs, you come to Terminal 49. And maybe one more thing I'll say, I think like getting data is one thing. Getting data that you can reliably use that's timely and complete, where a lot of the real value is, um, you know, from a company like Terminal 49 or Vision, OpenTrack, Genosis Freight. There's many of us out there, Four Kites, Project 44, that our job is not just to provide access to this data, but access to the data so you can actually do your job efficiently. You can rely on this data. You get more up-to-date data without having to do anything, right? It just shows up in your system. And so there's more than access that like companies in the space that are spending effort and investing in. So you have reliable data quality.
Cool. Great
All right.
conversation.
Have a
Can't
good
wait for the
one.
next one.
All right. Bye.